They thought I was finished the moment they started making decisions without me, but what they didn't understand was that silence doesn't mean surrender. The night after my husband was buried, the house felt larger than it had in 32 years, not because anything had changed, but because everything had. I sat at the dining table we had picked out together from a small shop in Vermont, my fingers resting on the smooth wood he used to polish every Sunday morning, and for a moment, I could almost hear his footsteps coming down the hallway, steady and familiar, the way they always were. But the house stayed quiet. Too quiet. Daniel cleared his throat across from me, his voice low, almost careful, like he was choosing each word before letting it out. Rebecca sat beside him, perfectly composed, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching me with that polite expression she wore when she was about to say something that wasn't meant to be kind. "We've been thinking," she said, her tone soft but firm, "about how things should be handled moving forward." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked down at my plate, at the untouched food I had prepared out of habit more than hunger, and I realized that no one had asked me if I wanted help, or if I needed anything, or even how I was feeling. They had already moved past that part. Daniel nodded slowly, still avoiding my eyes. "It's just, there's a lot to manage now. Bills, accounts, the house." His voice trailed off, but Rebecca didn't hesitate to finish the thought. "And it might be overwhelming for you," she added, her lips pressing into a small, controlled smile. Overwhelming. The words settled in the room like something heavy, something final. I had managed that house for decades. I had balanced every account, remembered every payment, handled every repair, and somehow, overnight, I had become someone who couldn't keep up. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the faint tremor in my fingers, but not letting it reach my voice. "I see," I said quietly. Rebecca leaned back slightly, as if she had been waiting for that moment of agreement. "So Daniel and I thought it would be best if we took over most of the responsibilities, just to make things easier for you." Easier. Another word that didn't mean what it sounded like. Daniel finally looked at me then, but only for a second, just long enough to make it seem like he was including me, before his attention shifted back to his wife. "It's temporary," he said, though his tone didn't carry much conviction. I nodded once, slowly, as if I was considering their proposal, as if I hadn't already understood what was happening the moment Rebecca started speaking. They weren't offering help. They were taking control, and they expected me to let them. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second stretching longer than the last, and I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. I wasn't part of this conversation. I was the subject of it. I stood up carefully, pushing my chair back with a quiet scrape against the floor, and for a moment, both of them went still, watching me as if they were waiting for some kind of reaction. But I didn't give them one. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't remind them of everything I had done, everything I had built, everything that still belonged to me whether they acknowledged it or not. Instead, I simply said, "If you think that's best," and turned toward the hallway. As I walked away, I could feel Rebecca's gaze lingering on my back, measuring, calculating, already planning the next step. What she didn't realize was that I was doing the same. I woke up before sunrise the next morning, not because I had slept enough, but because the silence had changed. It was no longer the quiet I had known for years, the kind that felt peaceful and familiar. This silence felt occupied, as if decisions had already been made while I was still lying in bed pretending everything was the same. I sat up slowly, the weight of the night still pressing against my chest, and listened. There were footsteps downstairs. Not hesitant, not uncertain, confident. I wrapped my robe around me and walked toward the staircase, my hand gliding along the banister that Daniel used to slide down as a boy, laughing while I pretended to scold him. The memory felt distant now, like something that belonged to a different house, a different life. When I reached the bottom step, I stopped. Rebecca stood in the kitchen, her back to me, already dressed, already moving with purpose. She had opened drawers that I had organized for years, shifting things slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough that I noticed. The coffee machine was already running, the smell filling the room, but it was not the way my husband used to make it. He always added a little extra water, said it made it smoother. This was stronger, sharper. "Good morning," she said without turning around, as if she had known exactly when I would appear. I thought I would get an early start. "There are a few things we should organize today." I nodded, though she could not see it, and stepped into the kitchen. Daniel was at the table, scrolling through his phone, his expression focused, detached. He looked up briefly, gave me a small smile that did not reach his eyes, then looked back down again. "Morning, Mom," he said. "Mom." The words sounded automatic, like something he had said too many times to think about anymore. I poured myself a cup of coffee and took a small sip. It was too strong. I set it down. Rebecca turned then, holding a stack of papers in her hands, neatly clipped together. "I went through some of the mail that came in," she said, placing the stack on the table in front of Daniel, not me. "There are a few accounts that need attention, and I think it would be easier if we consolidated everything." Consolidated. Another careful word. Daniel nodded as if this had already been discussed. "It makes sense," he said, "just to keep things organized." I watched them for a moment. The way they spoke to each other, the way decisions passed between them without ever reaching me. I noticed the small things. The way Rebecca sat in my husband's chair without hesitation. The way Daniel did not seem to notice. The way the mail, addressed to me, stayed in front of him. I pulled out a chair and sat down slowly, folding my hands together to keep them still. "What accounts?" I asked, my voice calm, steady. Rebecca glanced at me, her expression polite but faintly surprised, as if she had not expected me to ask. "Just the usual," she said lightly. "Utilities, property taxes, insurance. Things like that. Things like that. Things I had handled for decades." Daniel finally pushed the papers slightly toward me, but only halfway across the table, as if unsure whether to let go completely. "We can take care of it, Mom," he said. "You do not need to worry about this anymore." I looked down at the papers, then back at him. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, standing in the doorway of this same kitchen, asking me if he could stay up past his bedtime. But that boy was gone. In his place was a man who believed he was helping by taking something away from me. I nodded once, slowly, and did not reach for the papers. "If that is what you think is best," I said again. Rebecca smiled, satisfied, and gathered the documents back into her hands as if they had always belonged there. The conversation moved on without me, shifting to schedules, appointments, plans for the week, all of it discussed as if I were not sitting right there at the table. I listened. I watched. I learned. And as the morning light filled the kitchen, I realized something that settled deep and steady inside me. They had already started rearranging my life. What they did not know was that I was already paying attention to every move they made. By the third day, I no longer needed to ask what they were doing. I could see it in the way the house moved around me, subtle shifts that no one mentioned but everything revealed. The mail no longer sat neatly in the ceramic tray by the front door where I had kept it for years. Instead, it disappeared into Rebecca's hands the moment it arrived. When the phone rang, she answered it before I could take 2 steps toward it, her voice smooth, confident, introducing herself as if she had always been the one in charge. I noticed how she began using phrases that sounded official, practiced. "We will take care of that. I will make sure everything is handled." Not once did she say my name. Not once did she include me. Daniel followed her lead without hesitation. He started coming home earlier, not to sit with me or talk about his father, but to review papers at the dining table with Rebecca, their heads bent together, their voices low but focused. I would pass by and catch fragments of conversation. Words like transfer, authorization, access. They spoke in a language that was not meant for me, even though it was my life they were discussing. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found a folder open on the coffee table. It was my folder. I recognized the worn edge of the cover, the small crease near the corner where my husband had once bent it by accident. Inside were documents I had not looked at since before he passed. Property records, insurance details, account summaries. I stood there for a moment, staring at the pages, feeling the quiet weight of something I could not yet name. Rebecca's voice came from behind me, light but precise. "Oh, I was just organizing some of the paperwork." I turned slowly, meeting her eyes. She smiled, but it did not reach anywhere beyond her lips. "There was a lot that needed updating," she added. Needed. As if time itself had made me incapable. I nodded once and closed the folder gently, my fingers lingering on the cover for just a second longer than necessary. "Of course," I said. "It is important to stay organized." That evening, I went upstairs to the bedroom I had shared with my husband, the room that still carried the faint scent of his cologne, and I sat at the edge of the bed, looking around at the things that had not yet been touched. his watch on the dresser. The book he had been reading, still marked halfway through. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the absence fully, the quiet space he had left behind. But beneath that, something else had begun to settle. A realization that had been building slowly, piece by piece, with every small change I had witnessed. This was not about helping me. It was about replacing me. The next morning confirmed it. I came downstairs to find that the spare set of house keys, the ones I had always kept in the small wooden bowl by the entryway, were gone. In their place was nothing. Just an empty space where something familiar used to be. I did not ask about it. I did not need to. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and found Rebecca at the counter again, already moving through the morning as if she owned every inch of it. Daniel was beside her, reviewing something on his phone. They looked up briefly when I entered, then returned to what they were doing, as if I were a guest passing through. I poured myself a glass of water this time, not coffee, and stood there quietly, watching them without appearing to watch, listening without asking, learning without speaking. And in that stillness, I understood something with absolute clarity. They were not rushing. They were not forcing anything. They were taking everything slowly, carefully, so that by the time I realized what had happened, there would be nothing left for me to hold on to. I took a small sip of water and set the glass down. Then I turned and walked out of the kitchen without a word. Because sometimes, the most important thing you can do is let people believe you do not see what they are doing. That afternoon, I opened the closet in the hallway and stood there longer than I needed to, my hand resting on the edge of the door as if I had forgotten why I came. The shelves were still lined with the same boxes I had arranged years ago, labeled in my handwriting, each one holding pieces of a life that had once felt stable, permanent. I reached for the top box and carefully brought it down, brushing a thin layer of dust from the lid before opening it. Inside were old photographs, neatly stacked, corners slightly worn from being handled too many times. I picked one up without thinking. It was taken on a summer afternoon nearly 30 years ago, in the backyard when the oak tree was still small and Daniel had to stand on his toes to reach the lowest branch. My husband stood behind him, one hand steady on his shoulder, smiling in that quiet way he always did, as if he never needed to prove anything to anyone. I sat down on the edge of the hallway bench, the photo still in my hand, and for a moment, the house felt like it used to. Warm, lived in, safe. He used to say that everything we built was for the future, for the family, for the life we were creating together. I remember the night we signed the papers for this house. It was late, almost 10 o'clock, and we were sitting at the kitchen table with takeout containers pushed to the side, laughing about how serious the realtor had been. About every detail. He looked at me across the table and said, "No matter what happens, this will always be yours as much as it is mine." He did not say it like a promise. He said it like a fact. I believed him because he had never given me a reason not to. Over the years, we built everything together. Every account, every investment, every small decision that turned into something larger. When Daniel was in college and money was tight, we found a way. When the roof needed replacing, we handled it. When unexpected bills arrived, we adjusted. We never made decisions alone. That was the one rule we never broke. I placed the photograph back into the box and closed the lid slowly, the soft click echoing in the quiet hallway. Downstairs, I could hear Rebecca's voice again, moving through the house like it belonged to her, steady and certain. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, letting the contrast settle in. What we had built was not fragile. It had survived decades of change, of uncertainty, of loss. It was not something that could simply be handed over because someone decided it was easier that way. I stood up and returned the box to its place, aligning it carefully with the others, exactly where it had always been. Then I closed the closet door and walked back toward the staircase. As I descended, I noticed something else that had changed. The framed photograph that used to sit on the console table by the living room had been moved. It now stood slightly off-center, replaced by a decorative piece I did not recognize. I paused for just a second, adjusting it back to where it belonged before continuing into the kitchen. Rebecca glanced at me briefly, her expression neutral, but there was a flicker there, something small, something that told me she had noticed. Daniel did not look up this time. He was too focused on the documents in front of him. I moved quietly through the room, not interrupting, not asking questions, not offering opinions. Because the more I remembered, the clearer everything became. This was never about whether I could handle things on my own. It was about whether they believed they could take over without resistance. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the window, looking out at the backyard where that old oak tree still stood, much taller now, its branches stretching wide over the grass. Time had not weakened it. It had made it stronger, deeper, more rooted. I took a slow breath and let the memory settle into something steadier, something colder. Then I set the glass down and turned away from the window, already understanding that the next time they made a move, I would be ready to see it before it even happened. It happened on the fifth morning, in a way so quiet that anyone else might have missed it completely, but I did not. I was sitting at the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one my husband used to call my command center, going through a stack of old receipts I had pulled from the drawer the night before. I was not looking for anything in particular. At least, that is what I told myself. The sunlight came in through the window at just the right angle, illuminating the fine dust in the air, making everything look almost still, almost peaceful. Then I heard Rebecca's voice from the kitchen, lower than usual, controlled, careful. I did not move. I did not need to. The house carried sound in a way that made distance meaningless. "It is already in process," she said, her tone clipped but confident. There was a pause, followed by Daniel's voice, quieter, uncertain. "Are you sure we should not talk to her first?" I felt something inside me tighten, not with surprise, but with recognition. Rebecca did not hesitate. "If we involve her now, it will only complicate things," she replied. "This is for the best. Once everything is finalized, she will understand." Finalized. The word echoed in my mind, settling into place like a piece of a puzzle I had been slowly assembling. I set the receipt down carefully, aligning it with the others, my hands steady, my breathing even. They thought they were being discreet. They thought their lowered voices would keep me from hearing. But they underestimated something very simple. I had spent decades in this house. I knew how it held sound, how it carried intention. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway, not toward the kitchen, but past it, as if I had no reason to be there. As I passed, their voices stopped instantly, replaced by the soft shuffle of papers, the kind that signals a conversation has ended too quickly. I did not look in. I did not need confirmation. I already had it. Instead, I continued upstairs, each step deliberate, measured, until I reached the bedroom. I closed the door behind me and stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle again. Then I moved to the dresser and opened the top drawer where I kept the important documents. Inside, everything appeared as it should, neatly organized, undisturbed. But appearances, I had learned, could be misleading. I reached for the folder labeled in my handwriting and opened it, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. Property records, insurance policies, account summaries. Everything was there. Everything except one small detail that had never mattered before, but now stood out with startling clarity. The authorization page. The one that required signatures for changes, transfers, decisions. I stared at it for a moment, then closed the folder slowly, my mind already moving ahead. Downstairs, I could hear them again, their voices lighter now, as if whatever they had discussed had been settled. I walked back to the window and looked out at the backyard, at the oak tree that had stood through every season, every storm, every year that had passed without asking permission to remain. I thought about the word Rebecca had used. Finalized. It meant something had already been set in motion, something they believed could not be undone. I turned away from the window and sat down on the edge of the bed, my hands resting calmly in my lap. For the first time since all of this had begun, the picture was no longer unclear. It was precise, intentional. They were not preparing. They were executing. And they believed I was too overwhelmed, too distracted, too lost in grief to notice. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of amusement, but of understanding. Because the truth was, I had noticed every step they had taken, every word they had chosen, every silence they had filled with their own assumptions. And now, finally, I understood exactly what they were trying to do. The call came later that afternoon, just as the house settled into that quiet rhythm I had come to recognize, the kind that followed after Rebecca and Daniel finished their daily planning and moved on to whatever they believed was already under their control. I was in the kitchen, rinsing a glass that did not need to be rinsed, when the phone rang. Not Rebecca's phone, not Daniel's. The landline, the one they rarely used, the one they had already begun to treat like it belonged to another time. I dried my hands slowly and walked over, lifting the receiver before anyone else could reach it. "Hello." My voice was calm, even, exactly as it had been for days. There was a brief pause on the other end, then a familiar voice, measured and professional. "Mrs. Collins," he said. "This is Thomas Harrison." I did not react immediately, but something inside me shifted, steady and precise, like a lock clicking into place. Thomas Harrison, my husband's attorney, the man who had sat across from us years ago, explaining documents in careful detail, always making sure we understood every word before we signed anything. "Yes," I replied. "I remember." Another pause, shorter this time. "I hope I am not calling at a bad time," he continued, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer did not matter. "There are some matters regarding your husband's estate that I believe require your direct attention." I glanced toward the hallway, listening. No footsteps. No movement. Just enough distance to speak without interruption. "I see," I said. "And what kind of matters would those be?" He hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of caution. "It would be better to discuss them in person," he said finally. "There are details that should not be handled over the phone." Details. Another word that carried more weight than it appeared to. I turned slightly, lowering my voice just enough to keep the conversation contained. "When would you like me to come in?" "As soon as possible," he replied. "Tomorrow morning, if that works for you." Tomorrow. I looked down at the kitchen counter, at the neat arrangement Rebecca had created, every item placed with intention, every surface cleared of anything that did not serve her version of order. "That will be fine," I said. "I will be there." When I hung up the phone, I remained standing there for a moment, my hand still resting lightly on the receiver. The house felt different again, but not in the way it had before. This was not the quiet of something being taken. This was the quiet of something waiting to be revealed. I turned and walked toward the living room, my steps unhurried, my expression unchanged. Rebecca was at the table, reviewing a set of documents, her pen moving quickly across the page. Daniel sat beside her, watching, nodding occasionally, as if he were learning something new. They both looked up when I entered, their attention shifting just enough to acknowledge my presence. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked, his tone casual, almost distracted. I nodded once. "Just a call," I said simply. Rebecca's eyes lingered on me for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, searching for something, measuring, but I gave her nothing to find. She returned to her papers without another word. I moved past them and took a seat by the window, folding my hands neatly in my lap, the same way I had done so many times before. But this time was different. Because now, there was something they did not know. Something they had not accounted for. I watched them quietly, the way Rebecca leaned slightly forward when she spoke, the way Daniel followed her lead without question, and I realized how certain they were. How complete their confidence had become. They believed everything was already decided. That whatever they had set in motion could not be changed. I allowed that belief to remain untouched, undisturbed. Because sometimes, the most powerful position is not the one where you speak first, but the one where you already know what comes next. The next morning, I woke before the alarm, the same way I used to when there was something important to take care of, something that required my full attention before the rest of the house stirred to life. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the quiet, measuring it, understanding it. Then I got up, dressed carefully, and chose a coat I had not worn in years, one my husband used to say made me look formidable, though he always smiled when he said it. Downstairs, the house was already awake. Rebecca stood at the counter again, her routine unchanged, her movements efficient, controlled. Daniel sat at the table, his phone in his hand, his attention already elsewhere. They both looked up when I entered, and for a brief second, there was something like curiosity in Rebecca's expression, as if she had noticed a difference but could not yet. "Name it." "You are up early," she said, her tone light but observant. I nodded, reaching for my bag and placing it on the chair by the door. "I have an appointment," I replied. I did not elaborate. I did not offer details. Daniel frowned slightly. "An appointment?" he repeated. "With who?" I met his eyes then, just long enough to answer without inviting further questions. "With Mr. Harrison," I said. The name settled into the room differently than I expected. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with enough weight to create a pause. Rebecca's hand stilled for just a fraction of a second before she resumed her movement, placing a cup on the counter with careful precision. "Your husband's attorney?" she asked, her voice steady. But there was something beneath it now, something tighter. "Yes," I said simply. Daniel shifted in his seat, setting his phone down as if the conversation had suddenly become more important than whatever had been on the screen. "Is everything okay?" he asked. The question sounded familiar, but it no longer carried the same meaning. I adjusted the sleeve of my coat, smoothing it out as I spoke. "I believe that is what I am going to find out," I said. Rebecca turned then, fully facing me, her expression composed but no longer relaxed. "We have already been handling the estate matters," she said, her words carefully chosen. "There should not be anything urgent that requires your attention." I looked at her, not with challenge, not with defiance, but with a calm that did not need to prove itself. "That may be," I replied. "But Mr. Harrison specifically asked to speak with me." I let the sentence settle without adding anything more. Daniel glanced between us, his uncertainty now visible, his earlier confidence slightly unsettled. "Do you want me to come with you?" he asked. I shook my head once. "No," I said. "That will not be necessary." The room grew quiet again, but this time, it was not the same kind of quiet as before. This one held questions, doubt, a shift that neither of them had anticipated. I picked up my bag and moved toward the door, my step steady, my posture unchanged. As I reached for the handle, I could feel Rebecca watching me, her attention sharper now, more focused, as if she were trying to understand something that no longer fit into the plan she had so carefully constructed. I opened the door and stepped outside, the morning air cool and crisp, carrying with it a clarity that the house no longer held. As I walked toward my car, I did not look back, because for the first time since all of this began, I was not reacting to what they were doing. I was moving ahead of it. And inside the house behind me, I knew they were already beginning to realize that something had changed, even if they could not yet see what it was. I had not been inside Thomas Harrison's office in years, but the moment I stepped through the glass doors, everything felt exactly the same. The quiet, the polished wood, the faint scent of paper and coffee that never quite left the air. It was a place where things were decided carefully, deliberately, without noise or unnecessary emotion. A receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, asked for my name, then led me down a hallway that seemed longer than I remembered. Each step echoed softly beneath my shoes, steady and controlled, matching the rhythm I had already settled into. When the door to his office opened, he stood to greet me, just as he always had, his posture straight, his expression respectful. "Mrs. Collins," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming in on such short notice." I shook his hand, noting the firmness of his grip, the way he held eye contact without hesitation. "You said it was important," I replied. "I assumed it was." He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, and I sat down without rushing, placing my bag neatly beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He reached for a folder on his desk, a thick one, secured with a simple clasp, and rested his hand on top of it, as if considering where to begin. "I will be direct," he said finally. "There have been recent attempts to initiate changes to several assets connected to your husband's estate." I did not react outwardly. I simply listened. These requests were submitted under the assumption that the appropriate authority had already been established, he continued. However, upon review, I found inconsistencies that required verification. Inconsistencies. The word confirmed what I already knew. "And what did you find?" I asked. He opened the folder and turned it slightly so I could see the documents inside, neatly organized, marked with small tabs. "Your husband put specific protections in place," he said. "Not unusual, but thorough. Certain decisions cannot be executed without your direct authorization." I looked down at the papers, recognizing the structure, the signatures, the careful language my husband had always insisted on. He never rushed anything. He never left things open to interpretation. "So these changes," I said slowly, "they cannot be completed without me." "That is correct," Mr. Harrison replied. "In fact, any attempt to proceed without your consent would be considered invalid." I let that settle for a moment, not because I needed time to understand, but because I wanted to understand the full weight of it. "Were these attempts recent?" I asked. He nodded once. "Within the past few days." "Of course they were." I folded my hands in my lap, The same calm posture I had held at my own kitchen table, but this time, the meaning behind it was different. And if I choose not to authorize anything? I asked. He met my gaze directly. Then nothing changes, he said. Everything remains exactly as it is. Exactly as it is. I thought about that. About the house. The accounts. The life that had been quietly shifting around me, piece by piece, under the assumption that I was no longer part of the decision. I would like copies of everything, I said. All requests, all documents, all correspondence. He nodded immediately. Of course. He began gathering the papers, organizing them into a separate folder, one that he placed carefully in front of me. There is one more thing, he added, his tone slightly more measured now. I looked up. Your husband anticipated that there might be pressure, he said. He included a clause that ensures you retain full control unless you voluntarily decide otherwise. It cannot be overridden. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, slowly. That sounded like him. Always thinking ahead. Always making sure I would not be left unprotected. I picked up the folder and placed it in my bag, closing it with deliberate care. Thank you, I said. He inclined his head slightly. If you need anything further, you know how to reach me. I stood, smoothing my coat as I did, and walked toward the door without hesitation. As I stepped back into the hallway, the same quiet surrounded me, but it no longer felt uncertain. It felt clear, defined, because now there were no more assumptions, no more questions, only facts. And for the first time since all of this began, I was no longer observing what they were doing. I was holding the one thing they had not accounted for. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, the engine already off, the quiet settling around me like something familiar but no longer comfortable. The house looked the same from the outside. The same white siding, the same front porch, the same oak tree stretching its branches across the yard as if nothing inside had changed. But I knew better now. I stepped out, closed the door with a soft click, and walked toward the entrance with a steady pace, my bag held close at my side. As I opened the front door, the sound of voices drifted from the living room, low but tense, no longer as controlled as before. They stopped the moment I stepped inside. Rebecca was the first to turn, her expression composed but no longer relaxed, her eyes immediately dropping to the bag in my hand before returning to my face. Daniel stood beside her, his posture uncertain, as if he had been waiting for something he did not fully understand. You are back, Rebecca said, her tone even, but there was a question beneath it now, one she did not want to ask directly. I nodded once, closing the door behind me. Yes, I replied. I moved past them without hesitation and set my bag down on the dining table, the same table where they had been making decisions about my life just days before. The room felt different now. Not louder, not heavier, just clearer. Daniel stepped forward slightly. How did it go? He asked. I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, and saw the uncertainty that had begun to replace his earlier confidence. Productive, I said simply. Rebecca crossed her arms lightly, a small shift, but one that did not go unnoticed. Is there something we should know? She asked. I turned toward the table and opened my bag, removing the folder Mr. Harrison had given me and placing it carefully on the surface. I did not rush. I did not dramatize the moment. I simply rested my hand on top of it and looked at them both. There are a few things we should clarify, I said. The word clarify hung in the air longer than expected. Daniel glanced at Rebecca, then back at me. What kind of things? He asked. I opened the folder slowly, turning it so they could see the documents inside, the signatures, the clauses, the structure they had assumed they understood. The kind that require my authorization, I said. Rebecca stepped closer, her eyes scanning the pages quickly, her composure tightening with each second. We were only trying to help, she said, her voice still controlled, but no longer as certain. I met her gaze without raising my voice, without changing my tone. I know exactly what you were trying to do, I replied. Daniel shifted again, his discomfort now visible, his earlier certainty gone. Mom, we thought it would be easier for you, he said. Easier. The same word, but it no longer carried the same weight. I closed the folder gently and placed it back in front of me. Nothing changes without my consent, I said. That is not an opinion. That is how everything was set up. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind already working, already searching for a way to regain control of a situation that had slipped beyond her reach. But there was no space left for adjustment. No room for interpretation. Only facts. I picked up the folder and slid it back into my bag, the motion calm, deliberate, final. Then I looked at them both, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a clarity that did not need to be explained. From now on, I said, we do things properly. The silence that followed was different from the silence that had filled the house before. This one did not belong to them. It belonged to me. And for the first time since all of this began, they were the ones who did not know what would happen next.